They called it the pride of Germany, the Panther tank, a machine that rolled across Europe like thunder, fast, deadly, elegant. To Allied soldiers, it wasn't just a tank. It was a monster carved from steel. It could destroy a Sherman before the Americans even saw it. Its gun, long, precise, lethal. Its armor, sloped, cunningly designed to deflect shells that would have torn lesser tanks apart. And yet, as the war drew to a close, something strange began to happen. The Allies weren't afraid anymore, because for the first time they could get their hands on one, intact. The year was 1945. The war in Europe was ending. And deep inside the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, a group of American engineers gathered around a single captured German Panther tank. The air smelled of oil and wet steel. Men in khaki uniforms stood silent, watching as the dark gray beast rested on the testing field, its long cannon pointing toward nothing, like a ghost of the war itself. The men had heard stories. They had seen the wrecks on European roads, burned and broken. They had read the reports from Normandy, how the Panther had shredded entire columns of Shermans, how its gun tore through armor like paper. But this was different. This was their chance to see the truth for themselves. Was the Panther truly the masterpiece everyone claimed it was? Or had the legend grown larger than the machine? The team was led by Colonel Wadsworth, a quiet man with a reputation for brutal honesty. He didn't believe in myths. He believed in numbers, tests, and failures. As he circled the Panther, he ran his hand across its side armor and nodded slowly. "Beautiful," he muttered. "Let's see how long she stays that way." The inspection began. One by one, the engineers climbed onto the hull, unscrewing panels, tracing lines of welds, taking notes in thick leather-bound journals. What they saw amazed them. The Germans had built this tank like a luxury car. Precise fittings, clean cuts, meticulous attention to every bolt and bracket. Even the welds looked like art. One American mechanic whispered, "Now this is how you build a tank." Another smiled, "Maybe too well." They filled the fuel tank, checked the oil, and connected fresh batteries. Then, with a deep metallic groan, the Panther's Maybach V12 engine came to life. The ground shook. A black plume of exhaust coughed from the rear, and for a brief moment everyone just listened, the rumble of German engineering echoing across an American field. It was magnificent. The driver climbed in, pulled the transmission lever, and the tank began to move. Its wide tracks bit into the dirt, grinding forward with effortless power. The gun swayed like a giant's arm. Men stepped aside, watching it roll, half in awe, half in disbelief. But after only a few miles, the magic began to fade. At first it was subtle, a faint whine from the transmission. A few engineers looked at each other. By 20 kilometers, the whine became a scream. The gears were heating too fast. 30, smoke curled from the engine bay. They stopped to inspect it. Burned oil, stretched belts, metallic flakes in the fluid.
Colonel Wadsworth frowned.
"Push her harder," he said. And they did. The Panther climbed slopes, turned sharply, crossed mud and gravel. Every time, the sound grew worse. At 60 kilometers, the mechanics noticed the drive sprockets rattling. At 100, the right track jammed. By 150 kilometers, the Panther stopped moving altogether. Dead. Completely dead. Silence fell across the field. A machine that had once terrified the world now sat broken in the sun. The engineers gathered around. One of them wiped his hands on his coveralls and said quietly, "That's it? That's all she's got." Wadsworth didn't answer. He just told them to tow it back to the workshop. The test wasn't over, it had only begun. Inside the hangar, the men stripped the Panther piece by piece. They removed the gearbox, the transmission, the final drive, and laid them out on tables. The parts looked beautiful, intricate, tight, built to microscopic tolerances. But the deeper they looked, the more they realized the problem wasn't in the design. It was in the philosophy. The Germans had built their tanks like watches, precise, delicate, requiring perfect conditions. But war is not delicate. War is dust, heat, mud, chaos. And in those conditions, precision becomes fragility. Every part they examined told the same story. Over-engineered gears, complex oil systems, dozens of small components that had to work in harmony, and failed when even one did not. An American mechanic compared it to the Sherman. "Our tank looks like a tractor," he said, laughing, "but it'll run from Normandy to Berlin without complaining." Another added, "This Panther, it's a showpiece, not a soldier." By the end of the week, Wadsworth gathered his men for the final report. He didn't shout. He didn't mock the German engineers. He simply said, "Gentlemen, the Panther is brilliant, but brilliance doesn't win wars. Reliability does." He pointed at the disassembled gearbox on the table. "This," he said, "is the reason they lost. Not because we built better tanks, but because we built tanks that kept moving." That line stuck with every man in the room, because it wasn't just about tanks. It was about the difference between perfection and endurance, between the craftsman who builds for beauty and the soldier who builds for survival. Days later, one engineer wrote in his notebook, "The Panther is a masterpiece that died of its own genius." When the report reached Washington, it confirmed what many commanders already suspected. German tanks were deadly but unsustainable. They broke faster than they could be replaced. Each Panther that rolled off the factory line was a marvel, but it required constant maintenance, rare metals, and skilled hands. The U.S., meanwhile, could churn out Shermans by the thousands, simple, tough, and reparable by any field mechanic with a wrench and grit. That was the hidden strength of America's war machine. Not superiority, but simplicity. In the following months, the engineers at Aberdeen began developing their own concepts, based on what they'd learned. They didn't copy the Panther. They studied its failures. They realized that complexity can be a weakness disguised as sophistication. A German Panther might dominate for a day, but a Sherman or a Pershing would survive the week, the month, the campaign. And in war, survival is victory. Yet, despite everything, the engineers couldn't help but feel respect for the German designers. There was genius there, twisted perhaps, but undeniable. The Panther represented a mind that sought perfection, even when the world around it was burning. Colonel Wadsworth stood alone by the disassembled hull one evening, the setting sun glowing off the metal. He thought of the men who had built it, working under bombs, shortages, and orders from a desperate regime. He whispered to himself, "They built this thinking it would last 1,000 years, and it didn't last 100 miles. It wasn't mockery, it was sadness, because behind that machine was something human, the same pride, hope, and stubborn belief in progress that every nation shares." As the lights dimmed in the workshop, the American engineers left the field carrying more than just data. They carried a realization that would shape the future of warfare. That victory doesn't always belong to the most advanced machine, but to the one that simply keeps going. And somewhere, in the quiet of that empty field, the cold shell of the Panther seemed to whisper back, not in arrogance but in surrender, because even legends break. When the engineers opened the Panther's transmission housing, they expected to find damage, but not this much. The gears looked like they'd been chewed apart by anger itself. Steel teeth snapped clean off, bearings shattered, oil turned black and gritty with powdered metal. One mechanic shook his head slowly. "Good God! This thing's tearing itself apart."
Colonel Wadsworth leaned closer.
His cigarette burning low, eyes tracing the grooves along a cracked shaft. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Every man in the room already understood. The mighty German tank, the Panther, the terror of Normandy, was dying not from enemy fire, but from the strain of its own perfection. The Maybach HL-230 engine was powerful, too powerful for its own transmission. It could push the 45-ton beast across fields at incredible speed, but the mechanical guts inside couldn't take the punishment. It was like putting a racehorse's heart inside a glass chest. An American technician, a man named Keller, laughed bitterly as he wiped grease off his hands. "They made this thing like it was meant to win a race, not a war." Another replied, Yeah, and look where that got him. A race to the scrapyard. But Wadsworth didn't laugh. He turned and said quietly,
No.
They built it to survive a war they were already losing. Those words sank into everyone. Because when you looked deeper, the Panther wasn't just a machine. It was a mirror of Germany itself. Brilliant, desperate, and doomed by its own ambition. Perfection. Wadsworth said softly, can't survive on shortage. Outside the hangar, a rainstorm rolled in. Thunder echoed over the proving ground. As the engineers stood beneath the metal roof, listening to the downpour, they'd been at it for almost a week, testing, dismantling, rebuilding. And with every new test, their admiration for the Panther turned into something more complicated. It wasn't hate. It wasn't mockery. It was pity. Because beneath all that armor and steel, they could feel the fingerprints of men just like them. Engineers, mechanics, dreamers, people who had poured their skill into something they believed could save their country. And in the end, it had only hastened its fall. That night, one of the younger mechanics, a man named Donahue, sat beside the Panther's rusted track links, staring at the machine's cold eyes. He said quietly, You know, sir, it's strange. We always imagined the enemy as monsters. But someone built this. Some kid in a German factory welded this armor. Some engineer argued over the angle of that gun. They thought this would make them invincible. Wadsworth stood beside him, hands in his pockets. They thought the same thing we did, he said. Every side thinks they're building the future. The men continued tearing down the components. Each new piece told another story. The oil pump, overdesigned, too many moving parts. The fuel injectors, too sensitive, jamming from dirt or water. The cooling system, advanced but fragile. One loose fitting, one clogged line, and the whole engine overheated. American tanks, by contrast, were built with brutal simplicity. A Sherman could take a hit, break down, and still be fixed with a hammer and a wrench on the battlefield. A Panther needed a factory, skilled machinists, and time, things Germany no longer had. The engineers wrote notes late into the night, each page filled with contradictions. Brilliant craftsmanship, but unfit for war. Power, but no endurance. Beauty, but no soul. On the third day of the test, they decided to simulate long-range battlefield conditions. They replaced the broken gears, refilled the engine oil, and ran the Panther again. For a few moments it seemed alive, the low growl of its Maybach engine filling the hangar. But after barely an hour, smoke rose once again from the rear deck. The coolant was leaking. The final drive screamed. And when they opened the engine bay, one of the drive housings had split clean down the middle. The machine had destroyed itself again. Wadsworth looked at the wrecked part, his expression unreadable. He knew what this meant. The Panther wasn't just unreliable, it was unsustainable. He called in his lead analyst, Captain Morris. Together, they examined the metallurgy reports. The steel used in the Panther's transmission wasn't up to the standard of what German engineers had originally designed. Late in the war, Germany's factories were starved for high-grade metals. Alloys once rich with nickel and molybdenum had been replaced with cheaper substitutes. The result? Brittle gears. Beautiful designs ruined by desperation. The next morning, they began stress testing the suspension. The Panther's road wheels, all 16 of them on each side, were mounted in an interleaved pattern. It made the ride smooth, but it also made maintenance a nightmare. Mud and ice jammed between the wheels, freezing them in place. Changing a damaged wheel required removing 6 others first. A brilliant design for the Autobahn, a disaster for the battlefield. The Americans documented everything. Measurements, stress failures, metal fatigue, oil pressure. Their report filled hundreds of pages. Every detail mattered, because this wasn't just about understanding the enemy. It was about learning from him. They tested the Panther's armor next. They already knew it was strong, especially the sloped glassy plate at the front. A Sherman's 75mm gun barely scratched it. But when they fired a 90mm shell, A weapon designed for the new M26 Pershing. Punched clean through. The engineers took notes silently. Technology had caught up. The invincible Panther was no longer untouchable. As the tests continued, a subtle realization crept into everyone's mind. The Germans had built their tanks for duels. One-on-one battles. The idea that a single, perfect machine could dominate the field. But America hadn't fought that kind of war. They fought with logistics, with teamwork, with production lines. They didn't build one perfect machine. They built enough good ones. That was the true secret of victory. When the final report was complete, Wadsworth asked his men one last question. What did we learn? The room went quiet. Then Captain Morris said, "We learned that winning a war isn't about having the best tank. It's about having the tank that keeps going." Wadsworth smiled faintly. Exactly. He looked back at the Panther, its open hull gleaming under the hangar lights, a monument to wasted genius. Then he turned to his men and said, "Pack it up. We've seen enough." As they left the building, the wind swept across the test field, rattling the empty shell of the German tank. Somewhere in that sound, it was as if the Panther itself was whispering, not in defiance but in confession. Because for all its power, all its pride, it had one fatal flaw that no weapon could fix. It was too perfect for the real world. And in war, the real world always wins. When the hangar finally fell silent, the engineers didn't just leave behind a destroyed tank. They left behind a revelation. For weeks, the captured Panther had been their teacher, its failures the chapters, its broken gears the sentences of a story that no textbook could ever tell. Colonel Wadsworth stood by the cracked final drive, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. He wasn't just looking at a machine. He was staring into the future. He turned to Captain Morris and said quietly, "This thing's going to change how we build everything." Morris raised an eyebrow. "Sir, it's a failure." Wadsworth shook his head. "No, it's a warning. Because hidden beneath that failure was brilliance, an intelligence so precise it bordered on obsession. And America had just witnessed what happened. When genius outran practicality, the Panther had shown them everything, what to copy, what to avoid, and most of all, what not to become. A month later, in a dim office in Detroit, engineers from General Motors, Ford, and the Army Ordnance Department gathered around a conference table. On the wall behind them hung a large photo of the captured Panther, its turret tilted, its armor plates scarred from testing. Pinned beside it were diagrams of the M4 Sherman and sketches of something new, something the Army hadn't yet built. "Gentlemen," Wadsworth began, "we've seen what German engineering can do and what it can't. We need to take their lessons and build smarter." He pointed to the Panther's silhouette. This thing was over-designed, could kill anything in front of it, but it couldn't even drive 100 miles without breaking itself. "We can't afford to make the same mistake." An older engineer from Chrysler leaned forward. "So what are you proposing?" Wadsworth lit another cigarette. "I'm proposing we build something that doesn't care about perfection. Something that just works." The room fell quiet. They all knew what that meant. It wasn't about the prettiest design or the thickest armor. It was about reliability, mobility, survivability. The triangle of war machines. They began to sketch. A lower profile, heavier armor, better gun, simplified internals. They studied the Panther's sloped armor angles, and they kept that idea. They studied its interleaved wheels, and threw them out. They tested its high-velocity gun concept, and refined it with American steel. Slowly, the blueprint of a new tank began to take shape. It wasn't German. It wasn't American. It was both, born from the lessons of failure and the spirit of adaptation. This machine would later become known as the M26 Pershing, the bridge between the Sherman and a new era of American armor. By early 1945, the Pershing rolled into Europe. It was heavy, mean, and finally, a match for the German beasts. Its 90mm gun tore through the armor of Tigers and Panthers alike. When the first Pershing met a Panther in Cologne, It was the test that Wadsworth had been waiting for. The Panther fired first. Its shell struck the Pershing's glassy plate and deflected. The Pershing fired back. One shot. The Panther's turret erupted in flame. Somewhere halfway across the world, Wadsworth received the report. He read it slowly, then folded the paper and said to Morris, "Well, looks like the student just beat the teacher." But that victory wasn't about pride. It was about evolution. War had taught America what the Panther couldn't survive long enough to prove. That brilliance meant nothing if it couldn't endure. After Germany fell, the Allies gathered every scrap of technology they could find. Blueprints, parts, half-buried tanks. Anything that could teach them something. Panthers were shipped back across the Atlantic, disassembled bolt by bolt, each piece catalogued and studied. Wadsworth's team was now working with a new directive, not to win a war, but to prepare for the next one. They knew the Soviets were watching too. Rumors had already spread that the Red Army was testing captured Panthers of their own, trying to improve their designs. And if there was one thing Wadsworth understood, it was that innovation never stopped, not even in peace. He wrote in his notes, "The next war won't be about tanks that look strong. It'll be about the tanks that can keep fighting when everything else breaks." Those words would echo for decades. By 1947, the U.S. military had begun experimenting with new alloys, new engines, new transmission systems. Each improvement traced its roots back to that broken Panther. Better metallurgy, simpler drivetrains, redundant cooling systems. When one engineer suggested building something as complex as the Panther again, Wadsworth simply said, "You don't build a tank for the showroom. You build it for the mud." It became a mantra across every design bureau. And slowly, a new generation of machines emerged. The M46 Patton, the M47, and eventually, the mighty M48 and M60. All of them carried a little bit of the Panther's ghost inside. Not its flaws, but its warning. One evening, years later, Wadsworth visited the Army Museum in Aberdeen. There it stood, the same Panther his team had tested all those years ago. Restored, silent, majestic under the hangar lights. He walked around it slowly, his reflection rippling across its cold steel hull. A young officer approached. "Sir, is it true you tested this one yourself?" Wadsworth smiled faintly. "Yes, it nearly killed 3 of my mechanics." The young man laughed. Hard to believe something so beautiful was so unreliable. Wadsworth looked at the machine for a long moment before replying. "That's what makes it tragic." He ran his hand along the sloped armor, feeling the faint scars left from years of tests and combat. "This tank," he said, "was a masterpiece that forgot what it was built for." The officer frowned. "What do you mean, sir?" Wadsworth looked him in the eye. "It was built to win battles, but it tried to win history instead." The young man didn't answer. He didn't have to, because standing in front of that Panther, it was impossible not to feel something, a mix of admiration, sorrow, and awe. In the decades that followed, the lessons of that captured tank shaped the world's armies. The Soviets built the T-54, simple, rugged, unstoppable. The British built the Centurion, balanced, practical, enduring. And the Americans perfected the philosophy of power through reliability. By the time the M1 Abrams rolled off the line in the 1980s, it carried in its DNA the wisdom learned from the Panther's downfall. Could drive across deserts, through storms, over mud and mountains, and keep going. No elegant failures. No perfectionist breakdowns. Just relentless, unbreakable performance. And somewhere, if you looked closely enough, you could still trace the faint outline of the machine that had taught the world's engineers their hardest lesson. Because the Panther didn't just fail, it educated its enemies. It showed them the thin line between brilliance and arrogance, between design and endurance, between power and survival. Years later, when Wadsworth retired, he wrote a private letter to his son, a pilot who would go on to fight in Korea. In it, he wrote, "The Germans built machines that tried to be gods. We learned to build machines that served men. And that's why we won. That letter was never published. But in some dusty archive, it sits beside the old test reports from that captured panther. Pages of data, oil stains, and fingerprints of the men who studied it. If you hold those pages to the light, you can still see the faint outlines of their work. Their notes, their corrections, their awe at what they'd witnessed. And maybe that's the real story. Not of a machine that failed, but of a moment in history, when men learned that perfection is the enemy of endurance, and that even the most feared weapon in the world can teach humility. The war had ended, but the Panther refused to die. Even as its metal rusted on forgotten battlefields, its legend grew stronger with every story told about it. To some, it was the greatest tank ever built. To others, it was a mechanical tragedy, a reminder that brilliance could destroy itself. In the ruins of Europe, hundreds of Panthers lay silent, some half-buried under collapsed buildings, some burned out along country roads, some still standing hulks of steel, their guns frozen toward a sky that no longer burned. For the soldiers who had fought against them, those shapes still haunted their dreams. And for the engineers who had studied them, those same shapes became obsessions. Because even broken, the Panther whispered a question no one could forget. What if we had gotten it right? In 1946, a young German engineer, Hans Meyer, was working under Allied supervision, rebuilding war-torn factories. One evening, he came across an old Panther hull near Kassel. The paint had faded, the tracks had been scavenged, but the lines were unmistakable. He walked around it slowly, tracing his hand along the sloped armor. He had worked on this tank once, not building it but repairing it in a field workshop near Kursk. He remembered the heat, the dust, the desperate hope that maybe this machine could turn the tide. It hadn't, but it had come close. Now, as he looked at it again, he realized what the Americans had already discovered. The Panther wasn't a failure because it was weak. It was a failure because it was too perfect for a broken world. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "If the Panther had been simpler, it might have survived the war, and perhaps so would we." Those words captured something larger than engineering. They captured the soul of an entire generation that had chased perfection and lost everything. Thousands of miles away, Colonel Wadsworth was preparing to retire. His desk was cluttered with reports, old test notes, letters, photos of the captured Panther. He looked at them one last time before packing them away. He couldn't help but smile. So much of his career, the sleepless nights, the endless testing, the heated debates in Detroit boardrooms, had been sparked by that one machine. And yet, the irony never left him. America had learned more from its enemy's failure than the enemy ever learned from its success. He placed one of the old drive gears, a cracked, oil-stained piece of steel, on his shelf. A reminder that power without reliability was just noise. By the early 1950s, a new era of tank design had begun. The Cold War was brewing, and the lessons of the Panther were alive again. This time in secret laboratories across 2 continents. In the Soviet Union, engineers studied every piece of captured German technology. From the Panther's gun optics to its sloped armor geometry, they learned, copied, and evolved. The result was the T-54. Simpler, cheaper, unstoppable. In Britain, the Centurion emerged, practical, durable, battle-ready, could drive across Europe without breaking down. It didn't care about elegance, it cared about endurance. And in America, Wadsworth's doctrine had become gospel. Build it to fight, not to fail. The M26 Pershing evolved into the M46 Patton, then the M47, M48, and finally the M60. Each one faster, stronger, more reliable than the last. Every bolt, every weld carried a lesson, written in the ruins of that captured Panther. But time has a strange way of rewriting history. By the 1970s, the Panther's reputation began to change. New generations, who had never seen one burn in combat, started calling it a masterpiece again. Documentaries, Books and historians praised its design. They called it ahead of its time. They called it the best tank of World War II. They forgot the oil leaks, the broken gears, the stranded crews. They forgot that perfection had killed its own machine. To Wadsworth, who was now an old man, those stories felt hollow. He knew the truth, that the Panther was both brilliant and broken, paradox of beauty and failure. One afternoon, he was invited to speak at a military engineering conference. He stood before a hall of young officers and designers, and began with a simple question. How many of you have heard that the Panther was the best tank of the war? Almost every hand went up. He smiled sadly. Then you've heard half the story. He paused, letting the silence stretch. The other half, he said, is that it couldn't drive 150 kilometers without tearing itself apart. And when it did, no German crew could fix it in the field. That's not a weapon, that's a monument. He leaned closer to the microphone. And monuments don't win wars. The room was silent, not out of disagreement but out of respect. Because deep down everyone in that hall knew he wasn't just talking about tanks. He was talking about people, about nations that forgot the difference between power and purpose. In the decades that followed, the Panther lived on, not in battlefields but in museums. Children pressed their hands against its cold steel. Veterans stared at it with quiet memories, and historians argued endlessly about what it meant. Was it the best? The worst? A miracle? A mistake? The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. The Panther wasn't just a tank. It was a mirror. It reflected the arrogance of its creators, the courage of its crews, and the ingenuity of its enemies. It showed that even in destruction, there can be creation, that even a failed machine can forge the future. In 1982, long after Wadsworth had passed away, his grandson visited the Aberdeen Museum. He walked past rows of tanks, Shermans, Pershings, Pattons, until he saw it, the Panther, the same tank his grandfather had tested decades earlier. Its armor still bore the scars of those early trials, tiny cracks and impact marks preserved like fingerprints of time. He stood there for a long moment, then noticed a small plaque at the base. It read, Panther OSF, G, captured by U.S. forces, tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground, 1944 to 1945. From this machine came the lessons that shaped the next 50 years of armored warfare. The grandson smiled, because that single sentence said everything his grandfather had believed. The Panther had failed, but in its failure it had taught the world how to succeed. Even today, military academies still study the Panther's design, its armor angles, its weapon balance, its engineering complexity. They marvel at what it could do, and they shudder at what it couldn't. Because in every workshop, in every factory, there's still that eternal question. How far can you push genius before it breaks? And the answer still echoes from that captured machine. The Panther whispers it through history. Brilliance means nothing if it cannot endure. So when you look at the tanks of today, the M1 Abrams roaring through the desert, the Leopard 2 crossing rivers, the Challenger holding the line, you are looking at the children of that broken beast. Machines built not to impress, but to outlast. The Panther's ghost lives in all of them, not as pride, but as a warning carved in steel. Because the true victory doesn't belong to the tank that looks unstoppable. It belongs to the one that never stops moving. And that is the legacy of the Panther. Not in miles driven, not in battles won, but in the lessons it left behind. A monument to brilliance, and a masterpiece of failure.